Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, GDPR Update, Where Are We Now? Some logistical notes before we get started. You'll see two different ways to communicate with us throughout the webinar, the chat box and the Q&A box. Please use the chat box for all technical issues and the Q&A box for any questions related to the content of the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, Zoe Dowling, our SVP of Research at FocusVision, and Tom Myers, our Data Compliance Director at FocusVision. Zoe uses her extensive research expertise to help clients best apply FocusVision's technological solutions. And Tom has been actively involved in helping our clients through the complicated world of privacy-related rules, guidelines, and laws during his 17-year tenure with FocusVision. At this time, our presenters are going to turn off their cameras and get started. Zoe, Tom, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, everybody. Thank you good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you very much for joining us and being with us today as we take a look at GDPR. And we're almost 6 months in. Where's the time gone? And so it's a really good point to have a look and reflect on where we are. So as Rachel's just introduced us, I'm Zoe Dowling, SVP of Research here, and I'm joined today and thrilled to have Tom Myers, who's our Data Compliance Director. And we're going to have more of an informal chat about where we are with GDPR, what we at FocusVision have been doing, what we've been hearing from our clients, and we're also going to touch on what we've been hearing from industry organizations. I am going to have the caveat, you can see there at the bottom, neither Tom nor I are lawyers, and so we are not offering legal advice here. This is something you should definitely be going to within your organizations and seeking legal counsel. However, we have been very, very active over the last 6 months since GDPR came into effect, and also a lot of activities in preparation prior to it. So we've got a good base of knowledge, which we're looking to share with you today. And so with that, I think let's get started. And Tom, I think a really great place to start is recapping on the basics. And tell us, what's GDPR all about?
Thank you, Zoe. My math says that we are 5 months to the day from the start of GDPR. But I still think it's reasonable to recap what GDPR is, or at least what it is intended to be. The primary objective really was to give EEA-based individuals, which in our world are research data subjects, more control over how their personal data is used. I think that the market research industry has always been exceptionally careful and transparent in how it collects data from data subjects, no matter where that research is occurring. So this is not really a substantially new concept for us. GDPR is also designed or intended to standardize or harmonize the different privacy laws that already exist across the EEA region. And this is something that is absolutely needed, although I don't know that it's necessarily happening.
Yeah. So Tom, before you go on, can you clarify for me, what's EEA? You've talked about the EEA region.
So the EEA is the EU countries plus, I see if I get this right, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland.
So this is GDPR, is privacy regulations that's been brought in against the European countries plus a few others, so the EEA region.
Right, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but GDPR doesn't mean just research that's conducted in these countries. It also is in play in other research projects.
Okay. The other thing, I actually just wanted to pick up on what you said, because I completely agree with you about, a lot of what GDPR has brought in is something that is the basic tenets of what we have hopefully always done as researchers. And if you think back to the 1947 Nuremberg trials and the declaration, the Helsinki Declaration around how do no harm, seek consent. And so it seems to me that these regulations are putting into law some of the things that we already practice. Does that seem fair to you?
Absolutely. In the now almost 19 years that I've been involved at FocusVision with our clients, I've always been impressed by the way our clients have sought to protect the identity of the data subjects.
Yeah, no, that's good. Let's move on to you've mentioned sort of data subjects, personal data, and that seems to be sort of the crux, if I've understood it correctly, of what's going on with GDPR. Has the definition of personal data changed? Is this the same thing as PII?
It isn't. So personal data is now the new term, or as I say, personal data is the new PII, right? When I was working back with clients, I think almost more than 10 years ago, this term PII was created, and it was pretty much common sense, right? It meant personally identifiable information, and it was names, addresses, phone numbers, and at that time, something that was relatively new, which was even a person's image. The new personal data, which was created by GDPR, is intentionally broader in scope than PII. And part of that is because there's obviously a lot of new technology involved, but it still is a lot of common sense. We just have more addresses now than we knew. For example, IP addresses, right? An IP address is considered to be personal data, but only if it's used in conjunction with other data. So Zoe, if I sent you a spreadsheet full of IP addresses, there's really very little that you could do with it. But technically, you could be able to track down somebody if you had that information and could work with other entities to track back to a person who might have logged into a website or completed a survey. Obviously, for FocusVisions, we're mostly interested in image and also potentially voice.
Okay, so it's really thinking about the types of personal data, and that scope is broadened, like you said, IP, so that's internet protocol address, where you're accessing sites, the web from. But of course, it's also taking that information and be able to take it with other personal data and really getting, basically, I guess, a full picture of somebody's world, who they are.
Correct. It's
okay.
You can use a lot of information together to find somebody, and 10 or 15 years ago, that was less realistic.
Yeah. So before we move on, we have a question, and this is actually a great point to both say to everybody. I'm monitoring questions throughout, so please do put them in the question box, and we'll get to as many either during the conversation or towards the end as we can. And of course, we will answer questions afterwards. But Tom, I think this is quite useful because we've just been talking about the EEA, that doesn't roll off my tongue, the EEA states. And the question is, does GDPR apply to EU citizens that are located out of the EEA states? So for example, for me, I'm an EU citizen living in the US.
Correct. So it would not apply to you unless you were taking part in a research project that was being conducted by a company that was based in the EEA. But if it was a US company doing research, or a company anywhere outside of the EEA that was doing research, and you happened to be vacationing there, Zoe, and I, for some reason, wanted to participate in a focus group, you would not, by definition, be under the scope of GDPR, or that project would not be under the scope of GDPR simply because you were an EU citizen.
Okay, so it's those living in the EU taking part in the research.
Correct.
In the EEA states.
And again, the GDPR, I think, is intentionally ambiguous, but some of the ambiguity can be a little crazy. But technically, if I were in the EEA vacationing and taking part in a focus group for whatever reason, that project would be under the scope of GDPR simply because it was occurring in the EEA and I was there. So it does work both ways. Okay,
good. Let's move on, because I think we've started to touch on this, but and the real burning question is, well, what's the implications of GDPR for market research? How can we, for the research process?
Well, as I said a couple of times, and obviously I'm a big fan of the market research world, a lot of what GDPR requires, market research companies have been doing. So really all we're doing is expanding on a lot of the procedures and policies that we already have in place. But there's one area that has changed significantly, and that has to do with access to personal data. So this new concept of a broadened PII. And in this case, I'm really talking about access to unanonymized personal data. And the reason this is important is because GDPR regulates who can see personal data, who has access to it. And they do this based on roles. And there are two roles in play with GDPR. There's the data controller and the data processor. The data controller determines the purpose and means of the data processing. They're, if you will, the sponsor of the research usually, while the data processors like FocusVision are effectively just acting on behalf of the data controller. In most cases, I think it's generally agreed that the enterprise client and the fielding agency are considered to be data controllers. And sometimes they're referred to as joint controllers. So they share the responsibilities of the data controller. And the reason this is important is because GDPR requires that anyone who is in the data controller role must be identified to the research subject in order to have access to their unanonymized data. So again, in FocusVision terms, that means in order to see the data subject's image and potentially hear their voice. So this is without question, I think, the biggest issues that researchers and the industry have with GDPR.
Okay, so if I'm going to recap what I heard there, so there's the key things here on the big, you've got to know whether you're a data controller or a data processor. And for us at FocusVision, we're a data processor, and it'd be our clients, be it an agency, be it an enterprise, who are the data controllers. And the data controllers are the ones that determine the purpose and what happens with the data and are responsible for it.
Correct. There's in GDPR, there's obviously a lot of text dedicated to trying to make sure that people understand the difference between the two roles. But in general, if you are determining the purpose and the means of the data processing, so you have decided you want to field a study and to answer whatever question it might be, you fall into the data controller category.
Okay. And then so within that, the big thing that you pulled out, and this seems to be sort of the nub of what we as researchers need to wrap our arms around with GDPR, is that the data controllers need to be identified to the person participating in the research in order to have access to the anonymized data. So in order to be able to see their face, potentially hear their voice, and I guess know other where they live and things like that.
Right. It's crucial because of this concept of identification, right? And I think that there are a lot of aspects of compliance and being GDPR ready, but the sticking point is always going to be, for market researchers, this idea of identification.
Okay.
Right? If you are the data controller, you need to decide if you're going to identify to the data subject. If you decide against identification, you can still participate in the research, meaning that you can still observe so long as you don't have access to personal data. And again, in the FocusVision world, what this means is that you would be able to, say, listen in on a focus group, but not see the respondents' images.
Okay. So Tom, I'm just seeing a question, and I think it's worth going back to this one around data controller and processor. Somebody's saying, I'm still a bit confused about the identification of the controller. Can you just explain to us again who the data controller is?
So the data, as I say, I think the easiest way to think of it is if you're determining the purpose. So would this study have happened if you didn't, would this study have happened if you as a company didn't put something into motion to make it happen, right? So let's say there's a research agency, and the research agency on its own decides that it's going to go out and interview people and ask questions, and there is no sponsoring client. In that case, the agency is clearly the data controller because they are the ones that are determining the purpose of it. However, that's usually not the case, right? Usually what happens is that there is an enterprise client that's interested in learning something from the market, and as a result, they are effectively creating the need for this research project, and they therefore become the sponsor of it and a data controller.
Okay, so in that sense, there could be two data controllers, which could be the research agency as well as the end client?
Most often that is the case, because the agency is also determining how the data is going to be collected, potentially who is going to be reached out to. And so in most cases, at least on the qualitative side of market researcher, they are co-data controllers, joint controllers.
Okay. All right. Well, let's carry on, because I think we're going to keep unraveling some of the questions that I know that I still have and others on the line does. So, I mean, I think a big one is how do we, if we've got to, how do we conduct unbiased research and be GDPR compliant? So an unbiased meaning, if we've got to, in order to see, so again, this isn't going to apply to every type of data, like that we gather. So a survey, we typically don't collect any type of PII. So that wouldn't be part of, or GDPR wouldn't be a consideration. But if we are doing something like an online community, a webcam interview, a live focus group, then how do we conduct unbiased research? Because in that case, if we seeing those people, we would have to identify. And how do we conduct unbiased research and be within GDPR guidelines?
Well, if you believe that identifying the client biases the research, and I think most of us do, what you really need to do is you need to conduct the research in a way that you don't have access to it. But what we put together was a very simple decision tree that addresses this question of anonymization. And as we talked about earlier, there are really two criteria for determining if something falls under the scope of GDPR. One is, of course, is the research study taking place anywhere in the EEA? So it's being conducted with people who are currently residing, existing, breathing in the EEA. It's going to fall under the scope of GDPR. But it also applies to the data controller if they themselves are based in the EEA. So a company that's based in Italy or France or Germany that's conducting research outside of the EEA, that their project would still fall under the scope of GDPR, and they would have to follow GDPR guidelines. Let's assume, though, that in this case that it does meet that criteria and that this is going to fall under the scope of GDPR. The real question, again, is simply, does the data controller plan to identify themselves to the data subjects? If the answer is no, then anonymization tools need to be used so that the data controller doesn't have access to the personal data. So in our case, that would be blurring an image, distorting a voice, or blocking access to an image so that that personal data wouldn't be transferred. If they're planning to, then, and it seems that a lot of people do, then they can use all of our services without any modification whatsoever.
And at what point would you need to reveal that you're the data controller in order to, yeah?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's also one that's subject to a lot of interpretation. If you read the GDPR guidelines, it states that the identification must occur during the interview, and so a lot of people are deciding that during means at the beginning or at the end. What we're seeing with our clients is that most clients seem to be choosing to identify at the end of the interview to limit bias. but a lot of clients are still choosing not to identify at all and therefore using anonymization tools. There are also different guidelines, Zoe, within or between the different trade organizations as to when. So some people are simply following the guidelines of the organization that they're members of. But in general, what we're seeing, it seems, is a trend towards identifying at the end of the interview and still, therefore, being compliant with the idea of providing that identification during the interview.
So there's still, if I heard you right, ambiguity. I can't say that this morning.
It's a tough one.
Around exactly when that should take place.
Yes.
But we're seeing a lot of people doing that at the end of the session as opposed to revealing at the beginning.
Yes, and we had a few of our colleagues were at some trade events earlier in the year, and kind of listening to the buzz of the attendees, and it does again seem as though people feel that they can still be in compliance and identify at the end. Okay.
Let's keep going because I'm seeing some more questions coming in that do pertain along this. But I think as I've moved to this next slide because I'm seeing a lot of questions about voice, and I've moved on to anonymization. So perhaps can you talk to us about what is anonymization, and if you can touch into where does voice fit in this? Is voice PII?
Or personal data, right?
Yes.
So
sorry.
That's okay. I think when we talk about anonymization, there are a couple of things that is very important to remember. And aside from the obvious things, like I mentioned before, like names and addresses, right? We're really talking here about image and potentially voice. The anonymization tools that we've put into place are simply there to keep people compliant with GDPR. But they take different forms, right? If you're using one of our transmission products, right, we're obviously transmitting image and voice. We will anonymize that by blurring the image and also, on request, distorting the voice. Our interpretation, which we hope is being shared by more and more clients, is that voice alone is not personal data. But for those clients who have chosen to interpret that it is, we can distort it on our live streams. Some of this is technical in how we do it, so obviously we need to have some advance notice. Usually 1 business day is enough, but with that, what we'll do is we'll change the pitch of the audio so that people can listen to the natural voice and still be compliant. Across our services, though, as I say, we do have different ways of keeping people compliant. It's easiest to understand, I think, with our transmission products. So I put together a little bit of a grid here so that you can see what the differences are. For those people who use all these services, thank you, by the way. But each one does have a potential risk of having personal data in it. Obviously, our quantitative tools less so. But what we've done is we've created ways so that regardless of what service level you're using, you can anonymize the data. So for example, I'll just go through this really quickly. With Decipher, we have a PII flagging tool that restricts access to certain survey responses. And the way that it does that is that the user, the administrator, is allowed to rank the question in such a way that if the observer or user doesn't outrank the question's rank, they can't see the answer. So it's a flagging tool that we can use to restrict access. For interview, which is one of our transmission products, we don't have a way to blur the image, so projects are simply set up without webcams. And of course, that means that the recording will also be without webcams. our other streaming service, live video service, which I already mentioned. We can blur and distort the voice on the live transmission. But just as a caveat, that also means that the archive will be blurred and the audio distorted. What carries over from the live transmission is recorded. For Research Reporter, for those of you that use that, there are roles that are created, much like GDPR has roles, so does Research Reporter. And depending on the role that you have, that allows you to see or not see certain content that's stored on the platform. And then last but not least, our Revelation platform, we also have a privacy tool. And if that is enabled, it hides people's avatars, their images, it removes names, and then we can also limit access to certain questions by the user.
Okay.
The other thing that I forgot to mention, which I'm sorry, is that we don't by default activate any of these tools. And the reason for that is that we don't know whether or not a data controller plans to identify to a data subject. It was interesting, I took a look back at some of the streaming projects that had been conducted in EEA countries, and about 30% of them were anonymized. So it either had blurring and voice anonymization in play, but only 30%. So just please note that by default, just because you have a project that might be running in a country like that, we will not automatically blur it. We will only do it on request.
Because of that area, that element of you may be identifying to the people participating.
Correct.
So it's something that needs to be said, whether you're identifying or not, and therefore, if you're not identifying, that blurring needs to take place.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Let me move on. I'm just seeing one last slide here on.
Yeah, sorry. So this is the other thing that, I mean, we're obviously going through this GDPR topic in a very general way, but there is a lot of complexity to GDPR. So one of the ways that FocusVision can help is that by having a means to be GDPR compliant, regardless of the service that you're using, or again, hopefully all, we can reduce a lot of the administrative burden, as well as potentially the risk associated with using multiple suppliers.
Okay. Well, let's move on. I'm also conscious of time. We've got about 50 minutes left. I know we've got some more things to get through. There's a lot of questions. They're fantastic. Keep them coming. If we don't specifically get to your questions, we will get to it afterwards. We'll be posting a blog with all the answers and can get in contact with you directly. So please do keep putting your questions in. Tom, as we move on, and I'm seeing a lot of these questions come through, but what are we hearing from clients about their main pain points with GDPR?
Oh, so many pain points. There really are a lot, but we have actually touched on most of them already. And I think there are three that come to mind very easily. And the first one, again, is client identification, right? As I mentioned before, identification introduces a known source of bias, right? And this is something that has been methodically avoided by market research, by the market research industry, at least since I've been around, because it can introduce the opportunity for false or misleading data, right? And that effectively negates the reason to do the research in the first place. It's a very serious contradiction to market research best practices. So I think almost every client that I've spoken to is trying to deal with this in one way or another. And a lot of clients, honestly, they don't want to ever identify, which means that they're going to have to modify the way they do research, whether it's using FocusVision or not. And then I think the other sort of related one to that is when, and you already brought that up. Okay, I'm going to identify, but effectively, how much can I delay that identification so that I don't bias, or I reduce bias as much as possible. The next one, again, we've also touched on, and that's voice, right? The reason that we don't believe that voice is personal data is that even within GDPR, there are guidelines that state that in order for something to be personal data, and I'll kind of paraphrase here, it has to be something that could be identified to the data subject using reasonable means, right? So, of course, the technology probably exists for someone to take the recording of this webinar, and if they didn't know that it was me on here, somehow, I suppose, tracking me down. But is it really reasonable to assume that people will do that? You know, what would be the expense, not let alone what are the technical hurdles? So we think even within GDPR, unless the data subject is a known person, right, in which case, obviously, GDPR would apply because you already know who they are, right? Van Diesel comes to mind. That's one thing. But in general, we think that for the average data subject, it should not apply. And the third has to do with the scope, right? So scope of GDPR, we've talked about from looking at the decision tree, we talked about, okay, well, what are the criteria under which GDPR absolutely applies? And you think that that's very straightforward, but in fact it isn't. We had a client recently based in the US, but owned by another company based in the EEA, who felt that their research project that was being conducted entirely in the US was under the scope of GDPR. And I'd love to say that was right or wrong, but one would have to interpret whether that was the case. What are the rules around this relationship between potentially the company that is conducting the research and their parent company? How strong a relationship is that? What is it that would make that project truly fall under the scope of GDPR? And we don't know. And I think, I know we're a little bit short on time. I think honorable mention, the fourth one, would probably be this whole concept of technology being the problem, right? A lot of our clients have started to use technology, not just FocusVision, but technology in lots of ways to help them analyze research better and faster. And this idea that if you employ technology, it actually creates a different set of rules than if you were, say, sitting in person behind the mirror in a research facility. That's something that our clients are finding confusing.
Okay. So the last area I know we want to talk about, and I've seen so many questions referencing different trade organizations and their interpretation of the regulation. There's one thing that before I ask you to talk about your experiences and discussing and having different conversations with various trade organizations. The one thing I know you and I, Tom, have talked about is how a couple of things. How GDPR, everybody's learning that it's ambiguous. I mean, we've already talked about that, and I think it's worth stressing is how the law itself, the regulation itself, is incredibly open for interpretation, and that market research isn't alone in being struggling with really trying to hone in on a concrete interpretation and a single interpretation of that regulation. Is that fair? Is that right?
Of course. GDPR wasn't created just to single out the market research industry. On the other hand, I think that the GDPR should take into consideration what or how different industries have historically been handling data, right? It may be very far-fetched, but this idea of creating exceptions for industries in certain cases, we believe should be something that is realistically considered, right? The market research, I can't think of another industry, maybe that's just because I've been here so long, but I can't think of another industry that has taken the efforts that the market research industry has to protect data, because After all, if the market research industry didn't protect data subject personal data, the market research industry would have a very hard time getting people to participate. So yes, everyone is affected, but I think that there are these, I think they call them, is it something consequences?
Unintended consequences.
Thank you. The unintended consequences, like almost like collateral damage. Like it's part of the process. Well, I think that maybe that's something that can change. And trade organizations, at least the ones that we've been in contact with, obviously are starting to do that. They're starting to help their clients find clarity. But you yourself used the word interpretation. Even the trade organizations, right? They aren't the GDPR. The trade organizations can only interpret as well. And so they seek their own legal counsel, and they collectively try to come up with an interpretation that they feel is the best for the membership, but also for the membership to remain legal. What worries me is that this ambiguity is so extensive, right? How can you have these major organizations out there, trade organizations or individual clients, that can be taking such different interpretations out of the same law? I know that ambiguity is something that initially is almost encouraged, because the challenges that come out of it then start to fine-tune the law in a way that then it's more appropriate and more realistic. But still, the fact that we have some clients who think that they can't sit in the back room at a research facility to watch a focus group unless they identify, to some people who feel as though that they can use any one of our services or other people's services without really changing their behavior or identification scheme. That's I think a little scary, right? So it all is resulting in these unintended consequences. And one of the major organizations in Europe recently did a survey with its membership, and they found that the majority of people responding said that they had already felt the unintended consequences, which typically was a reduction in the number of projects conducted or requests for proposals or whatever it might be. So I'm not sure what the real answer is. We have at FocusVision, we have an interesting perspective because we deal across so many industries, right? We have this unique view of what's going on across market research. So we're trying to offer our help to the market research organizations to see how we can participate with them, act as advisors, whatever it might be. Individually, though, anyone out there that's struggling with GDPR, one of the things that you can also do is go to your data compliance person internally and start to ask questions and potentially start to generate more of a buzz, because the only way the commission in Europe is going to listen is if the market research industry unites behind these pain points.
Yeah. And I know, Tom, you've been doing a lot of active outreach, not just with various industry organizations, but also with sort of broader groups as well around GDPR.
Well, we have. So it's interesting. I recently went into a presentation in New York City, and the Data Protection Commission from Ireland was presenting on GDPR. And what I found interesting was, after the presentation was over, I think I was the only one that went up and started talking about the market research industry. Now, there could have been that no one else in the audience had anything to do with market research but I was the only one that went up there and started to, if you will, lobby on behalf of the market research world. And the nice thing about at least these representatives from Ireland was that they seemed to be genuinely interested in hearing about what was going on and how the industry was being affected. So again, I encourage everybody out there to start to push internally to whatever your grievances, if you will, to your data compliance people, so that it starts to move up. and get the trade organizations even more involved. Ideally, I think the trade organizations should get together to represent market research as one. I think that would be ideal.
Yeah. So, what I've taken from this whole sort of conversation is that, and also the questions, and thank you very much everybody for your questions. I know we didn't get to nearly all of them. I'm seeing a lot of themes coming through around data controller, data processor, voice still coming up as a lot of confusion, ambiguity around voice, as well as identification, as well as specifics on locations. So we will be following up with to address all the questions. So we'll be putting it out as a blog and answering directly as need be. But Tom, certainly what I've taken from this is a number of things on our side, in that there is a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of confusion out there across the board for GDPR, which is to be expected with such a large regulation that's come into play and will be continue to be refined over years to come. I think as well that it does mean sort of taking a look at what we do within our research practices, and identification is a real challenge, and thinking, what can we do without identifying, but also what can we do with identifying. So that might be another challenge for us as researchers to embrace, and thinking a little bit out of the box in terms of, can we take a different approach, and where is it possible and where is it not?
Yeah, and Zoe, a lot of the questions that it seems you're getting now, I think are addressed well in our GDPR Resource Center on our website.
Good point.
So even though we'll update the Q&A to add in any new questions, some of the more basic questions have already been addressed there.
That's a great shout out, Tom, and quite right. So if anybody on the line, if you're not familiar with our GDPR Resource Center, it's on our website. Go find it, take a look. There's a lot of information. We have a fairly large Q&A there already, although as Tom said, we're going to be adding any new questions from this session in there. So with that, I think we are going to wrap up. We're just at time. Thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time to talk to us today about where we are with GDPR. And I know this is an ongoing conversation, so we'll be back talking about it, I'm sure, in a few months' time.
Yes, we will.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom and Zoe. That was great. Unfortunately, it looks like we've reached the end of our time together. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, GDPR Update, Where Are We Now? And I know we've gotten quite a few questions in about receiving the recording, and yes, everybody will be receiving the recording to this. We also had over 50 questions today, and due to time, couldn't get to them all. So like Zoe said, we'll be publishing a Q&A follow-up blog, which all attendees will receive. Or if you have any pressing, questions that you want answered right away, you can contact us at webinars@focusvision.com, and we'll respond to your questions there. We hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you so much for attending, and have a great day.